Welcome to HealthBeat, the show that takes the pulse of South Africa's healthcare system. I'm Mia Malan. This month, we're coming to you from Cape Town, where we will be talking to Environment Minister Deon George about how he plans to deal with climate change.
The World Health Organization says it's the biggest health threat facing humanity. That became clear at the UN's climate conference, COP29 in Baku, which ended 2 days ago. But how does climate change work?
Our planet needs to be warm to sustain life. There's a natural way to keep it at the right temperature. It's called the greenhouse effect. It works much like the glass roof of a greenhouse, letting in the sun's heat during the day and keeping the temperature cozy inside at night. Burning fossil fuels like oil and coal emits gases that trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. These human activities are making the air warmer than it should be. The rising air temperature is called global warming. It drives changes in long-term weather patterns, also known as climate change. Because the Earth is an interconnected system, a change in one place causes a change elsewhere. So it gets wetter and stormier in some places and hotter and drier in others. The changes upset the Earth's natural climate balance, causing more extreme weather events more often.
In July, the President signed the Climate Change Act. But can our Environment Minister turn this into a workable plan? Let's find out. Minister George, thanks very much for your time. You have a background in finances. You've got a PhD in economics, but you're the Minister of Environment, Fisheries and Forestry. Does your finance background help you or complicate matters?
I think in some instances there's a disadvantage because I don't fully understand maybe the technical discussion that's going on. But on the other hand, it's all about the money. And that's the whole issue about where we are currently in the big debates on climate. COP29 was all about the finance.
Now, one of the things that happened very quickly after you became minister was that the Climate Change Act was passed. So if you had to explain what it's all about to someone who doesn't understand that act, what would you say?
Well, what it is really, it's the enabling legislation for South Africa to transition its economy to a low-carbon economy. Now, that's a massive thing to be doing, and me as the minister, I'm responsible for setting sector emission targets. So for each sector, we are going to be looking at the emissions that come out of that sector. There's basically a balloon of carbon, really, that is acceptable to be emitted in the world if we're going to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius objective. So we don't want the world to heat up more than that. And then you've got to work backwards from that and say, if we're not going to emit more than that, what does each nation do as a contribution? Then, of course, what does South Africa do as its contribution towards that goal? So the Act enables that. So it gives the minister the power then to set those targets. So in very simple terms, is to say each industry needs to look at itself and say, how do we operate but stop emitting as much as we do? It's not going to happen overnight. I mean, we know the complexities that we have in our municipalities. They battle to provide basic service, and now they are actually expected to put together a plan to combat climate change. We've got amazing legislation. Where we battle is the implementation.
And accountability is such a tricky thing here. So how will you hold these sectors accountable?
In terms of holding to account, so for example, if I do not ensure that the sector emission targets are done on time, etc., then I must be held to account. And what actually happens is I am to be held to account by the president, who I would report to, and of course then the people of the country.
I'm just going to bring you back to the municipalities. So if the municipalities run behind their targets or their plans, how will you get them back on track?
Well, I think in the first instance is that they need to set the plans themselves. So I think that would enable them to look at themselves and say, well, what is it that we think is possible? Obviously, there are parameters. So what they'll do is they will design their plans, they will put them together, and then they would own those plans. What my intention is that I want to assist the municipalities to get their plans done reasonably and sensibly so that the targets are achievable and then move in the right direction. And it is very much doable.
Now, the Climate Change Act is a big step forward, but when will we see parts of it being proclaimed?
Well, the act was signed, as you know. It needs to be gazetted. Without putting any words in the President's mouth, I'm expecting that we should see that soon, because in the process of rolling out an act, what you do is firstly it gets signed, and then of course you've got to indicate your preparation for it as well. We've done that now. So we've said, well, this is the plan. I've written to all the entities, for example, the other departments, the municipalities and the provinces. So we've prepared that, and we've started setting sector emission targets as well. But I do work very closely also with Minister Ramaphosa, Energy and Electricity, because he is very much animated about getting enough money to make sure that he can roll out the projects, the green projects that need to replace the Eskom power station.
Are we looking at early next year?
My expectation is that we should be looking in the first half of the year. I think that we should be seeing some really good movement. And also, as I mentioned earlier, is that we are already talking to the other departments, because of course, I'm not going to come from my department and say, well, this is your target. No, what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation and say, look, this is what we need to do.
After the break, we travel to Snake Park in Soweto, where climate change is worsening pollution. Welcome back to Health Beat, where we're looking at how climate change is changing the world. But first, what is it like to live in a toxic environment you've got no control over?
Our team visited Snake Park in Soweto, where climate change is making it even harder for people to deal with mine pollution.
In Soweto's Snake Park, Thokozile Mtambo is gearing up for a battle. Her weapons of war, a laptop and a questionnaire.
We went door to door doing research, asking people how the tailings are actually affecting their health.
Togo and her volunteers from her community are looking for proof that the sicknesses they see here are caused by mine waste or tailings.
Mining companies not consulting communities, but them receiving mining licenses while communities are being affected by the environmental degradation. We interviewed old people who lived in Snake Park. We interviewed people who are living with disabilities. We interviewed parents who have children who are living with disabilities. We interviewed people who are living with chronic illness like asthma and lung cancer.
About a third of all gold ever mined came from South Africa, buried in the rocks as deep as 3 kilometers underground. As the city of Johannesburg grew, a layer of pollution spread over the area. When mining companies had taken all the gold they could, they left behind harmful waste. Things like chemicals and heavy metals, which Togo believes have impacted her family in Snake Park.
My sister gave birth to a child with cerebral palsy. She was staying here for like 5 years. Yeah? Her child, she cannot walk even now. She stays at Allen Klein, the care center, because now my sister passed away. My mom also passed away because she had breathing problems. My brother has asthma. I'm also asthmatic. Every time when I go to the clinic or to the hospital, they tell me, do you smoke? I don't smoke, but they can see when they're doing x-rays, there's a lot of dust in my lungs and stuff. And it's not only happening to me, it's happening to everyone.
The answer is to clean up the dumps. It's what Togo and her friends tried to do by planting sunflowers that would soak up toxins from the soil. But now they're not allowed on the dump, and the sunflower project has died. The government can't afford to clean up these dumps. Yet, when gold prices go up, companies still come in to try and make money from whatever gold is left. Pan African Resources, listed on the London Stock Exchange, now has a license to re-mine tailings.
Our concurrent environmental rehabilitation of these historic tailings deposits is already improving air and water quality in the area.
Togo says Pan African, which has barred entry to the dump, hasn't told them what they're planning to do to make it safe.
And now there comes Pan African, they're talking about re-mining. To communities is unjust because it's exclusion. So what I want the just transition to be just, because now it's unjust. For it to be just, it must work for everyone.
Togo volunteers for Benchmarks, a foundation that keeps an eye on multinational companies and their responsibility to local communities. Benchmarks thinks Snake Park is heading for disaster.
We have global warming or this environmental catastrophe that is now happening where you have extreme heats, extreme rains. One of the catastrophe is for that tailing to break entirely because of the rain. It has broken, it has a crack.
Benchmarks brought in an international expert on tailings dams to say if Snake Park is safe.
The person was so devastated to see the conditions of the tailing. And for Pan-African to be doing something about it now, so the worst case scenario with the extreme weather is for that tailing to entirely break into that community.
Pan African Resources told us that rehabilitation plans at the site kicked off in September, and independent reports show there's no danger of the tailings dam collapsing.
We want change, and we want communities to be involved in decision making. This is how you do it with communities. You don't just come with a jargon of papers and you explain and you expect people who are illiterate to read 100 copies of the environmental assessment plan. Like, it doesn't make sense. Make it simple for communities to understand.
Pan African says it's the local government's job to deal with people living so close to the tailings dam, and the company has talked with some community members and is watching dust levels at Snake Park. They plan to do a health check in 2025 to see if there's any risk from radiation.
Joining me online from Johannesburg is Professor Angela Mattea from the South African Medical Research Council. Angela, thanks for your time. We've seen in this insert that tailings dams can become more dangerous if we see more floods. Why is that, and how does it work?
Tailings dams independently do pose hazards to health, especially particulate matter, air pollution, especially the very small particles, and then all the metals that they contain. In Snake Park, it's a gold mine dump, and scientists that have measured the contents of those mine dumps have found arsenic, lead, mercury, for example, and those are associated with various cognitive implications and also with specific ones, respiratory, etc. The cognitive implications are the ones that have been studied the most, and lead amongst those three has really had a lot of research published about it. So we know that lead is associated with reductions in IQ scores, with difficulties in learning at school. It damages the kidneys, and because of that, there's a higher risk of high blood pressure and in turn a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And there's some studies also coming out now over the past decade and a half showing a link between lead exposure and aggression and violent behavior.
One of the women in this story mentioned that she's seeing more babies with cerebral palsy. And normally we associate cerebral palsy with a lack of oxygen or not enough oxygen during birth. Is there really a link between that and mine dumps?
In July of this year, a study was published. It was a large study undertaken in Canada, and the scientists looked at over 1.5 million mother-baby pairs. And in that group, they found several thousand babies with cerebral palsy, and they could show a link between the mother's exposure to fine particles, air pollution, during pregnancy and cerebral palsy in the baby. The increase was significant but small, and the authors have called for more research. But in my personal opinion, that's a red flag that we should be paying more attention to.
Scientists also say as the earth becomes hotter, air pollution becomes worse. What's the explanation behind that?
So I always think of it as the evidence from studies in Europe, where they show that air pollution is associated with a 5% increase in death rate, high levels of air pollution, especially those fine particles. And independently, heat waves, they are associated with a 6% increase in death rates. You might naturally expect that if the two are combined, so if you are exposed to air pollution during a heat wave, you'd have 11% increase in mortality. But what those studies in Europe show unexpectedly is that instead you have a 21% increase in mortality. So it's just this shocking, unexpected mortality rate that just shows the cumulative impact of those two scenarios on health.
How does it work in your body? Why can't your body absorb both the heat and the air pollution?
So normally our bodies have a balance between a group of molecules called free radicals. Those molecules serve a purpose in the body. So they, for example, tackle other molecules that are harmful to health. But the body has a compensatory mechanism, antioxidants, that when there are too many free radicals, the antioxidants tackle them and reduce their harmful capacity. And as I said, normally there's a balance between those two. But when you are then exposed to air pollution and to high heat, those contribute to the side of the equation on the free radicals. And they increase them and they overwhelm the body's capacity to produce enough antioxidants to fight those threats.
Angela, what should we put in place to fix these things?
For specific issues like mine dumps, to make sure that the mine owners rehabilitate them, because we see, even visually, you can see how when mine dumps are properly grassed, the air pollution deriving from that mine dump is greatly reduced. We're living in a new era with new threats, and so we need new standards and we need new approaches to the protection of public health.
Thanks for your time and insights, Angela.
You're most welcome.
After the break, find out what will happen to your diesel car and carbon taxes.
Well, I think that the whole idea of a carbon tax is to actually change behavior.
You're watching Healthbeat from Cape Town, where we're visiting our Environment Minister to find out how he will make the Climate Change Act real. Right now, I'm standing at Mully Point. The beach line you see here will be closer to flats and houses in future.
That's because climate change makes the earth increasingly hotter. And higher temperatures make the massive icebergs in places like Greenland and Antarctica melt. That adds more water to the ocean, and that's why sea levels are rising. The big danger, scientists say, will be when spring tides and storms collide. A once-in-a-century extreme flood could become a yearly or more frequent event from 2050 onwards, putting people who live close to the beach in danger. At the UN's climate change negotiations in Baku this past week, Environment Minister Deon George fought for South Africa's interests.
So, what about rising sea levels? How is South Africa planning to deal with that?
It is a big problem in the making. Cape Town, in particular, has started mapping what it expects the sea level to do. So, for example, if you look at the waterfront, the possibility is that the water would be then closer to the buildings, etc. And so what needs to happen is we need to make sure that any buildings that are done are climate resilient buildings.
What would that look like?
Well, it costs a lot of money, so you need to build them differently. So you need to build them in such a way that they're going to be able to withstand the pressure maybe of stronger waves, etc., or you need to move further back. So you might find that people would have to move to different places. We have lots of communities along the coast, but if we find, obviously, that if you see that your road is falling into the ocean, you might not be able to build it back. And that's going to put quite a lot of pressure. We have been speaking as a government very much about insurance, but in South Africa in particular, we do have a climate response fund that we are working on at this very moment, that we committed to put in place by the end of the financial year. And that's basically to say, how do we then insure in a way those calamitous events? Because insurance companies won't insure anymore. Many people living right near the coast find they can't insure their houses anymore because the insurance companies are getting nervous.
Are there any specific plans for Beach Road in Mully Point, in Sea Point? What would happen to those?
I'm sure you'll see that there's been a seawall that's built there in Sea Point. And that was specifically in response to what was happening with the sea level. Further up in Mully Point is where there's been dunes built now and plants have been placed there. There's also a wall. So the idea is that we'd be able to absorb in a way. Also, there's quite a bit of peace between the ocean and the road. So if you look at what's projected for sea level rising, if it carries on at the rate it's going, it's unlikely that you're going to find Beach Road underwater, for example. But that all depends on what happens when this starts going faster. And I think that what we're seeing is an acceleration of the impact. We have a lot of storms, and I think it's KwaZulu-Natal that gets heavily hit. It's because of its geographical location. What happens is there will be more and more erosion on the coast, for example. And that means then, well, if there's a flood, people will be very heavily impacted.
What does carbon tax mean to the average South African? So if you drive a car, using petrol or diesel, in 10 years from now, would you be heavily taxed for using a car like that and not an electrical car?
Well, I think that the whole idea of a carbon tax is to actually change behavior. Now, of course, people's behavior will not change if they don't have the means to change the behavior as well. But what it means to the person in the street, if we do have an additional tax, for example, or if we as government decide that we are going to increase the carbon taxes, then people are going to pay more for things, and it is going to hurt. And I don't believe that there is a space for additional taxes. Certainly not now. Our economy isn't growing fast enough. We are not able to actually transition easily. All I think the average person is interested in is to say, well, look, what is the cost of living for me? How is my life going? Because it is, in fact, the role of government to provide basic services, infrastructure, etc., upon which people can build their ability to have the lives that they want to live.
Minister Deon George, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
That's our show for this month. Let's hope South Africa does make the changes that our health depends on.